When the clock had struck 3:15, day 1 of the invasion, or merely 3 hours and 15 minutes into the invasion as a whole, including here at the Battle of Houston, the total shock and awe of the entire invasion was still fresh, as it was merely just 3 hours and 15 minutes into it by the time the battle had initiated at the George H.W. Bush International Airport in the direct north of the city's core metro area, as 3,000 PLA troops in 3 separate battalions from the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, its armored battalion, and 2 mechanized infantry battalions had struck the international airport at the same time as the regimental engineering battalion was fleeing from heavy artillery barrages carried out by the 83rd Artillery Brigade, as its PLZ-05 howitzer battalions of self-propelled guns had showered the entire area with 155 munitions, as its A300 battalion fired its short-range ammunition, as this was the longest-range artillery system in the world at a whopping 187-mile range. It had short-range ammunition firing its minimum-ranged ammo at the downtown area and just slightly beyond, as the neighborhood just to the south of downtown, where the HHT of the 278th ACR was based with their logistics safely for the time underneath a highway segment that the PLA did not want to risk destroying, had the adjacent areas shelled by 300mm strikes from the A300s, as well as tactical ballistic missiles that were fired from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade that was in eastern Texas near the Apt Battle, that materialized to the east of it as a Trojan unit, firing its DF-11As and DF-15Cs in support of operations all throughout the battle space and its other systems as well, with DF-11As and 15Cs earlier fired at Joint Base Ellington, with DF-11As predominantly being they which were fired upon key buildings in which some of the HHT troops had been utilizing as part of their bivouac locations that had been heavily missiled, including even by sea-based missiles from the CJ-10 land attack cruise missile strikes coming in from the Renhai-class stealth cruisers that were off the coast of Houston, as well as the YJ-18B submarine-launched cruise missiles from the Song-class subs as well, hitting the area around the same time the tactical ballistic missiles, DF-11As, were striking as well, with A300 systems blanketing the area and rockets, and also even aerial-based attacks from massively destructive Tu-22Ms wreaking havoc on massive portions of the city, as one single strategic bomber squadron of these massively destructive large aircraft carried the equivalent of 16 Hiroshima atomic weapons in terms of their conventional payloads, blasting enormous portions of the city to complete rubbled and cratered ruination. As by the same time the airport battle had initiated, moments later, just literal minutes later, the 2 armored forces of 2 different armored squadrons, the 1st Squadron of 278th ACR, which was configured exactly like the 3rd Squadron, which had by now been destroyed by 2 PAP battalions and their dedicated tank hunting teams with their very potent HJ-08 anti-tank missiles with ample loitering munition support from heat warhead-equipped CH-901As, as well as also their dedicated attack drones in the form of their Loong 2 combat drones, and even close air support operations conducted by J-10 fighters of the PLAAF in this particular area to assist the PAP forces in destroying American armor where it stood in an upscale suburban neighborhood stretching into a commercial area that was located adjacent to the State Highway of 249, covering the advance of 1 battalion deep into downtown, with the other 2 PAP battalions surrounding and destroying armed reactionary civilian resistance in a wealthy, upscale, and heavily wooded neighborhood before proceeding to further clear the flanks for their headquarters battalion to move supplies rapidly to the new line of contact in downtown, whereby the earlier advancing battalion was beginning to seize key remaining buildings that had not been completely shelled or carpet munitioned or rocketed into the ground or struck by missiles, including a DoD building that had been heavily hit by tactical ballistic and also sea-based cruise missiles from the PLAN vessels. As all of this was occurring and the fighting in the airport wouldn't wrap up until just after 6 a.m., or it would take approximately 3 total hours for the armored battalion, including the armored infantry forces, to go through all of the airport buildings and clear them of defenders, as the different counterattacks, which were haphazard and disorganized due to America's lack of ISR capabilities, conducted by the Regimental Engineering Battalion's forces that had survived the shelling, would all be fended off and the remaining buildings cleared by the armored infantry companies within the armored battalion, as the anti-tank company within the armored battalion would sit back and would give support to the tank companies and armored infantry forces, methodically clearing the airport as the battle unfolded. As all of that was going on, the 2 different battalion-sized forces of 2 different squadrons, the 1st Squadron of 278th ACR and the 1st of the 98th Cav, that were now embattled trying to push away or even possibly destroy the PLA forces, as transiting civilians, both combatant and non, had been America's only source of information as it pertained to their military and other forces. As they moved through the area, they had informed these forces of the PLA muster and assembly points and activity thereupon, which had threatened the logistics, as this was one of the 2 major forward logistical points, as one had already been overrun by a mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Bde. The other was highly threatened by the mechanized infantry battalion from the 113th that had materialized dangerously close to it and would end up holding the line in a trap that had been laid for these 2 very potent armored forces of these 2 Cav squadrons, as a Tu-22M would carpet munition them nearly entirely out of existence, with the remainder destroyed by the anti-tank forces of the mechanized infantry battalion, which included their very powerful VN-20s with their HJ-12E anti-tank systems, as well as the HJ-08 wielded systems by the dismounted infantry forces of the mechanized infantry, and even rocket-propelled grenades, which were nearly ubiquitous throughout all Chinese forces, as they were produced in unquantifiable numbers and were passed out liberally to their army and paramilitary elements, as they would be used on the lighter vehicles, including the M113 APCs, of which they had no problem dispatching, such as those used by the People's Armed Police, as well as those used by the PLA against the M113 APCs, such as this one destroyed, about to be hit by another rocket-propelled grenade. This already destroyed one about to be hit again by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile in this image, as these PAP troops were firing them at the armor and other armored vehicles, including Bradleys and M113s, in addition to the heavier vehicles, including the tanks, and again the Bradleys. As all of this was underway, the PAP shock forces and their very fast and nimble and agile WZ-551 wheeled armored vehicles with their very potent IFV version with the 25mm autocannon and 7.62x54 coax, with the APC version with a turret which had a W-85 heavy 12.7mm machine gun, while supported by their dedicated drone section within their headquarters battalion, firing volley after volley of CH-901A loitering munitions with their varied warhead types dependent upon the mission, and their Type 74 flamethrowers, HJ-08s, and rocket-propelled grenade weapons, including even also tube-fired grenades from beneath the rifles of some of the troops that carried such. These forces were a devastating and destructive force that specialized in crushing insurgencies, but was also equipped in such a way where they could go toe-to-toe with military units of enemy nations as well. And this particular PAP brigade had ISR assets at the squad level, whereas many PAP forces had them at the platoon level, which was still at a low enough level to where even if each and every platoon had one, they could still surveil the battlefield in real time at an exceptionally high rate. But with each and every squad possessing one within the 36th Brigade of the PAP, they were able to map in real time even more detailed the ever-evolving fluid modern battlefield as these forces went through buildings or destroyed others outright with their flamethrowers, 25mm autocannons, which are vehicle-based, as well as anti-tank missile systems, and more, including even loitering munitions when necessary, as well as their mortars, which they could call in from their dedicated mortar company that was actually within their headquarters battalion, which they had their fire support assets at the brigade level instead of the battalion level with a fire support company, unlike the PLA forces. In this brigade, they had it at the battalion level with their mortar company firing 82mm mortars in support of all their different battalions. As that had occurred, this 30-minute and very short engagement in the southeast of the city had ended with the Tu-22M smashing all but one company and one rifle platoon, which had just barely been out of the range of the path of the Tu-22M strikes, and was able to participate at another battle that was slightly to the south and east of the fight that had occurred near the Buffalo Bayou tributary, whereby the mechanized infantry forces moved from their CCP property to a very nearby city park where they held positions and were ready for the advancing American forces as they had ISR dominance and could see them coming from literal miles away as they organized their forces and moved into the area. As the PAP forces were again moving in to clear the remaining flanks of their battalion already in downtown and doing much of the heavy fighting there for the time being until PLA forces were finishing their logistical refit and consolidations of the areas they had recently captured, including after destroying the 2 artillery battalions, or 1 fire squadron of the 278th ACR, and also 1 artillery battalion, the 2nd of the 114th, which were together in this area and had been starting to actually shell PLA forces as civilians transiting the area had told them of the rough locations. They had been rapidly destroyed by a mixture of tactical ballistic missile strikes, Tu-22M strikes, J-10 fighter strikes, loitering munition strikes, and armored strikes, as well as more, as the anti-tank company and armored infantry had contributed in that fight as well with their very powerful VN-20s, their Type 89A armored personnel carriers, and their infantry-based firepower against the American artillery systems in that specific area before both battalions had moved into West Houston to block off the downtown area while the People's Armed Police were already in downtown doing fighting, with one of their battalions about to be joined by others upon them cleaning the flanks in Northwest Houston in a very heavily urbanized area, as these 2 battalions that had cleared the northern flank of the highway for the advance of their battalion that had finished clearing the outer flanks, as its leading elements were literally moving down the highway, as 2 additional battalions destroyed the 3rd Squadron and a grouping of spread out armed reactionary civilians. These 2 battalions that had cleared this wooded upscale neighborhood had moved into the inner city and began to clear its neighborhoods by cordon and sweep operations, which were highly precise operations whereby the vehicles of the different comprising combat companies of the PAP battalions would surround an area. They would dismount some squads to provide mutual support, but all of the vehicles would have interlocking fields of fire as they surrounded a large area, whereby the high altitude recon assets and the lower level quadcopter assets and even satellites all interlaid to provide a real-time unfolding view of the enemy activity in any given area. And as they would be surrounding these forces, they would have absolute artillery fire support from not only their own mortars of their headquarters battalion, but also from the howitzer battalions of PLZ-05 howitzers from the 83rd PLA Artillery Brigade of the 83rd PLA Group Army, who would be firing in support of these PAP operations to cleanse the northwestern urban areas of any and all armed civilian resistance. as even the armored battalions from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade were receiving artillery support as well against paramilitary and armed civilian elements in western Houston to the south. In this area, there were combined nearly 1,000 armed reactionary civilians in two different pockets that have been broken up as PAP forces moved into the area and surrounded one area with one battalion and another area with another. This pocket will be explored. As we go to the map, what had essentially occurred was to the south and to the north and all the way to the east, two PAP companies of the battalion moved this way, one moved this way and veered to the south, and two more moved behind it to the north and blocked off the streets to the immediate north and south and also to the immediate east of this block right here, that part of which is on the map. As this street here was a commercial street with many small urban businesses one would expect to find in any major city, including the shopping center here and very small connected shops and a fast food place and some more shops on the other side and a gas station. This street was a commercial street with this street and beyond essentially being residential, as the backyards were separated by a small wall from the businesses that were on this street right here. Essentially, as the PAP forces raced to surround the area, they would coordinate their actions on the perimeter with the hammer forces of these two companies as they would move in. All 7 combat companies of the battalion would be utilized in this endeavor, as 2 companies spread out as the hammer force, 2 spread out in the south, 2 in the north, and 1 to the east, providing the outer cordon on that area right there. The vector, angle, and traverse of fire would be very precise and very highly precision-oriented, as these forces would constantly stay in communication through their combat data links carried at the NCO squad level and also in each and every vehicle, as well as radio communications, and they would coordinate between companies to ensure that there were no friendly fire incidents, as the artificial intelligence would also update them on the precise angle and traverse of weapons, when it was safe to use them, and what ammunition types were safe to use at any given moment, so as the cordon and the hammer forces would never be able to fire on one another, thus cutting friendly fire absolutely down to zero. Especially in this instance here, as a high degree of precision was required to carry out these operations, as these types of operations had been conducted in many previous wars, but there was always a degree of uncertainty as it pertained to friendly fire, as there could be moments where any miscommunication could lead to friendly fire from the cordon and the sweeping forces that were the hammer and anvils. As this map opens up, there's ample activity going on all throughout the map. This very same Tu-22M flying over the area was that which had flown over and destroyed these 2 battalions or squadrons, 1st and the 98th and the 1st Squadron of 278th ACR, before flying over this area and moving to hit another part of the city with the remaining munitions it carried aboard. As it transited the area beneath had just been freshly surrounded by the cordon forces who were on the adjacent streets on the next block down from here and abutting this block right here while these forces were to go through and clean it out. As artillery strikes were already incoming at the opening of this map and destroying this area, many technicals or civilian vehicles with armed civilians in them, with small arms predominantly, or in some very few with Molotovs who had the actual implements and were quick enough to be able to make some, had been destroyed in the opening artillery fire, and many were beneath these blast icons of shell impacting. And the vehicles on the outer blast radius and personnel of armed reactionary civilians have been completely KIA'd and destroyed in this shelling, with imminent artillery shelling to come in just a bit later in the battle. However, the opening mortar strikes had already KIA'd these armed reactionary civilians and these between these 2 buildings, gutting these buildings and badly damaging this area where this parking lot is, destroying abandoned vehicles and more, while they had also KIA'd these armed reactionary civilians. This technical flying into the area to escape the cordon forces that just closed the loop before having to turn around, seeing the destruction, which scared them back, ended up getting cut down by the hail of fire coming from the cordon forces, whose vehicles had interlocking fields of fire the whole way down the line on both sides, north, south, and also to the east. As fire would have to be precise and coordinated well to ensure no friendly fire, the outer cordon forces could shoot up the streets at least until their hammer forces got near where their angle of fire was oriented, and then they would have to hold fire to allow for the sweeping forces to gradually move through and essentially do the job as it pertained to clearing areas. Many houses would be burned down, as many neighborhoods were already being put to the torch by the People's Armed Police with their Type 74 flamethrowers, an old favorite of theirs. While one of the two headquarters platoons of the Hammer Forces had arranged itself around this apartment building that was 3 floors high, they used this building as it was the tallest building in this particular part of the neighborhood, upon which they could have their 2 sniper spotter teams, which were part of the headquarters platoon, to provide overwatch for their troops as they moved through this area of relatively low housing, most being 1 floor, very few being 2 floors. But this building still gave them a relatively general overwatch of a very large area with their sniper spotter teams and their scopes and associated spotting equipment to be able to provide any type of fire support necessary from the capacity of any type of sharpshooting or sniping that was needed as it came to supporting the troops and vehicles even moving on the ground, as the vehicles and troops were all mutually supporting as well, as the vehicles served as a mobile fire support platform for their dismounted squads, and they had not even dismounted all their squads per each platoon. There were also 3 squads in each of the advancing platoons that remained inside their vehicles and could be dismounted at any time if and when needed, with the other 2 squads of each platoon on each side of the advancing vehicles to peel off and clear buildings or destroy them when and where necessary. The reason they did not destroy all buildings was because they had wanted to net some POWs for intelligence reasons, and also some just to make examples of, which had a broad connotation, but it was very nasty, and leave them in public places on display to inform the locals that they were in the area as it pertained to their paramilitary brutal elements. There was one of the Loong 2 dedicated combat drones. This one had already fired some of its 12 munitions aboard in previous engagements, but was firing its last 4 in support of the operations here, with at the opening having had fired further back by this megachurch parking lot. They fired CM502 KGs, two of them, and 2 HJ10s, which there was 1 of each on each side being fired, which both were very powerful missiles and highly destructive to property, vehicles, and personnel, and even bunkers in some cases, and destroyed these 2 technicals in conjunction with ground-based fire coming from well in excess of a mile away. These 25mm autocannons had an extensive range and would be vectored at the right angle facing downwards to where they would hit this vehicle and this vehicle alone and go no further. Same with all the other vehicles and their fields of fire and managing their angle and traverse of weapons and the types of weapons utilized. As this missile tracked its target starting to move up the street, it hit that in conjunction with 25 fire. This one was hit by just a missile which damaged this building as well. These 2 missiles, an HJ-10 and CM502KG, destroyed these houses and KIA'd anybody that was in the immediate vicinity in the backyard and the front of this house. These missiles destroyed all of these personnel, but these personnel had survived for the time being. And as anybody crossed the street, they had run the risk of getting caught up in any of the fire vectored in. Again, the angle and traverse was of the utmost importance, aiming somewhat downward so as not to fire too far down the streets and hit one another as it pertained to the cordon forces, and would be cut down by intersecting fire coming from the lead vehicle as well as fire coming from both ends of the street. And again, as they would move up and clear a city block, the cordon forces would hold their fire because they would not risk engaging in friendly fire incidences, and the snipers were supporting the activities as well from the high rooftops, with everything from the urban terrain playing a role in these operations, to the precision of the AI systems advising the forces on the ground, to the communications of the combat data links carried by each NCO of each squad and in each and every vehicle, with radio communications as well, informing everybody on their positioning and where they were at any given moment in time and where they were about to be, as communications were a constant. And they were burning this house down and this house down as they finished clearing these properties, this building and megachurch upon which the headquarters platoon promptly moved in to establish itself and put personnel on the roof, with others staying in these MRAPs and Shangji trucks, fueler, and Type 15 armored recovery vehicle of the headquarters platoon of one of the two companies, with the other headquarters platoon off map and the rest of this park. At the opening, these forces moving into this area between these rubbled buildings and badly gutted home are being cut down by a hail of fire from 12.7 millimeter, 25 millimeter autocannon, blasting its armor-piercing HE ammunition, which was hitting this area with a vengeance, KIAing these first five right here, with these taking fire behind, moving in and being cut down, as the arrow indicated in red highlights, because they're moving into this area between these rubbled buildings, this gutted house and this one that's a complete rubble pile, with loitering munition strikes as well, aiding in the destruction, with the fire coming from small arms from the troops, from vehicle-based fire, loitering munition strikes, and the artillery strikes decimating everybody that was under them and immediately around them in terms of the technicals and dismounts that were just on the outer blast radius, as these forces were trying to flee in the wake of all the vehicles moving through the area, with the troops who didn't peel off and opted to burn this house and this house as the vehicles moved up. At the same time the artillery was lifted, they were moving up. They moved up each block and coordinated their actions all the way up and down the line, as they would stop at each corner and coordinate their actions, allowing for their ground troops to go in and clear each and every building on each and every block, unless it was non-applicable because homes were already destroyed, in which case they would continue moving after briefly looking in the rubble piles for any enemy forces. And they coordinated their actions up and down the line like so, including with the outer cordon forces, as again, these vehicles had been destroyed at the opening by fire coming from this direction of the 25 millimeter autocannon, as all these vehicles scanned their sectors of fire, which included the lead vehicle scanning its sector and the vehicles behind with staggered weapons clearing their sector and providing overwatch for their troops, as these turrets sat higher up on the vehicle and at times could safely fire over their troops, which were coordinated with the troops. As they burned this building down, causing these civilians to flee, same as what occurred here, as this building was being burned down by the flamethrower operator of this squad and this squad. These guys have been cut down in a very short, brief exchange of fire, including with a loitering munition strike coming from these loitering munitions patrolling the area. This vehicle was destroyed, fleeing from fire that clipped the back of the vehicle from the 7.62 by 54 millimeter machine gun coax weapon on the lead vehicle, the lead WZ-551 from its coax, and it clipped the back of the vehicle, causing it to pull in here. But then when fire began to come down, they had pulled around to try to get out of the lane of fire up and down this street, and ended up getting hit by an ISR-directed mortar strike. Another one hit here and got these guys behind this house and badly gutted these homes. And as that was going on, these forces torched this home, causing them to flee, as had been the case here. While this squad peeled off to clear this building, this one was already on fire from when their Type 74 man burned it. And as these guys fled into this house and their squad began to clear this house, this squad began to clear this house and quickly went into this house, finding no enemies here. And as by which time they had all fled from this house into this house. And as that was going on, these guys were moving through this area gradually, and these guys were beginning to move up the street as well, temporarily pausing here as the artillery fire had been lifted, while these guys paused here on the end of each block, while these other troops went through and cleared these buildings. Now, they came out here and laid down fire, suppressing fire, while their flamethrower man burned this building down, in addition to these troops of this squad coming out and doing the same here, with assistance from their vehicles firing their 7.62 by 54 millimeter at an angle along with 50 cal, which was like their 12.7, firing into this house as well at an angle, at a safe angle and traverse of the weapon, with these forces firing directly into it and into this one as well, with a flamethrower being used. And by which point these guys had been KIA'd, as this was a flimsy chain link fence, and they were trying to stay in the prone, but they were all cut down by the hail of fire, including 35mm grenade fire and even anti-personnel rocket-propelled grenade rounds from Type 67s. This house would eventually be shredded up so badly. By the time they kicked this door open to clear it, there was only one survivor who fired at them and hit one of them in their vest, but they just cut them down with the hail of fire. These vehicles, again, were destroyed by fire vectored down the street at them, including all the way down here as well. These guys KIA'd by some of the fire from the coax as they ran into this building, which would be destroyed in relatively short order, as there were other armed reactionary civilians inside of it, and the building would be hit as these forces gradually made their way towards it, as this building would be burned down with these personnel inside of it, while the fire intersected through it from these squads. These were all KIA'd by this point, including they, which were in this backyard of these homes here, and on the other side of the fence of this backyard of this property and this property here. They had all been cut down. As by that time, this squad moving through the area, again, their vehicles were up here assisting in this. They assisted in this action as well while they came out the door after clearing this building. These personnel had fled from the flaming home and entered here, and this house was burnt down as well while taking heavy fire from these troops and the vehicle as well, as the vehicles behind sent 12.7mm rounds flying into it, including the lead vehicle firing 25 autocannon with the flamethrower that just blasted this into flaming wreckage. These guys KIA'd as a result. These guys began to flee the area and had been cut down by some of the fire coming from the forces that were up and down the street on the cordon forces that could see up and down the street with their optics, and had cut them down, as well as their ISR assets hovering over the area from all these forces whose all ISR assets linked together and processed through the AI data processing, sent the imagery back to the combat data links, informing them where enemies were at every given moment. And they were cut down by fire coming from the lead vehicle and from up and down the streets. They got caught in intersecting fields of fire. And while some made it across and into this house, many did not and were wiped out where they stood. As these forces then, after burning this house, bounded to this fence line, a short, brief exchange of fire occurred before they then went in and cleared this house to check for anybody left in it. Finding none, they prepared to bound across the street, but were waiting for their vehicles to move up with them tactically. And as they moved into this house, these guys got caught in some nasty crossfire from the vehicles. At the same time, these vehicles were about here, and these vehicles were right here, beginning to move. These squads peeled off and began to clear these buildings before this squad went in here, and this squad broke into two half squads, one peeling off outside of the side of this house, taking the corner, laying down suppressing fire tactically for this other half squad to move as a stack team and begin to go through these houses in typical stack team formations, kicking in the doors of each and every room, sometimes throwing hand grenades in, other times rushing into the room, to each man taking a corner, running to this corner of the room, firing as typical stack teams do in tactical fashion, as these operations were conducted in a very rapid form, as the stack teams would stack in hallways along doors, kick them open or rush in, or kick open a door, toss in a grenade, and eliminate enemies inside. Most of these enemies were not expecting such a rapid and robust type of assault against their positions, and many buildings were cleared in such a form. As they went through these buildings, they laid down suppressive fire. When this squad holding the corner earlier laying suppressive fire then went in and kicked this door in and cleared this of any survivors that had survived the fire earlier coming from them first, while they went in and cleared this building before they then fired back and forth, and then they came in and cleared the rest of the building and KIA'd any survivors from the earlier fire that they'd laid down while they were at the corner, and then they laid down fire, allowing for them to go in while they took a turn laying suppressive fire. And then they held their fire as their half squad was clearing this building while these vehicles were moving up, and this squad was clearing this building at the same time. As this squad peeled off and took the corner as well at the same time, as this building was a complete rubble heap, and they looked in it, checked it, made sure with their ISR quadcopter nothing but was in there before they took the corner. The other squad peeled off and went down this way and was now exchanging fire with these forces. At the same time, this squad had cleared this house and moved into this area here, while their vehicles had already dispatched these personnel. Some of these had survived, and some of these had survived the missile strikes and the vehicle-based fire. And these two squads vectored their fire and finished off any of these survivors. Before this squad broke into two aft squads, cleared each of these homes, this squad proceeded into this remains of this area right here. This house was destroyed by a missile, so they checked the wreckage of it and took the position in the front yard and prepared to lay suppressing fire so that these half squads could bound into their positions, which they did. And there were a few survivors from this mortar strike here, which they had laid down heavy fire upon from these homes, including when this squad broke into two half squads. They took position here and laid some suppressive fire this direction while they bounded across, and also for their other half squad, stack team, to break into this house and go through it and clear it, from which point they then took position in this house and laid down fire along with these two half squads, while their other half squad bounded to join them. Reuniting as a full squad, they then went and cleared this house, while these two half squads left this area and crossed this little wall that separated the backs of these businesses and parking lots from the backyards of these homes. At the same time, this full squad again broke into two half squads. They, climbing over the fence, took position here tactically to lay down any suppressing fire on enemy forces, while the other half squad cleared the gas station, while these two half squads went in and cleared this area. At the same time as that was going on, at exactly the same time, these loitering munitions had come in and KIA'd these personnel, as indicated by the red surrounded, or the green surrounded in red, and these guys were KIA'd. This mortar had already destroyed this technical and these personnel here, causing these to flee into this area, who took some fire as they crossed the street from the outer cordon forces. While that was going on, these two half squads that had cleared these buildings, turning into a full squad again, went in to clear this building, while they then went in, a half squad went into this house through its garage, cleared it, and the other half squad bounded to watch the fence before they reunited as a full squad and cleared this fast food place after the mortar had struck outside. While that happened, the vehicles were moving up, including the vehicles that went down this across the street, broke through part of this house because it was in the way, and smashed through this wall to keep up with their troops as they advanced into the area, while this squad to the north of the vehicles went through this house, broke into two half squads. One went out the back, one went into this house to clear it, while the vehicles broke through part of the house, and then they went out with them before moving in to clear these buildings. While this one went out on the side, this half squad cleared these buildings before they went around the corner to reunite with them as per SOP, being outside of a building while the other clears it at times, as that could be part of the standard operating procedure of clearing buildings. If not vehicles, it was always at least troops that stood outside of buildings while other elements cleared them. Either vehicles or troops or both, as that was SOP for such operations. As that happened, and all of this was going on at the same time, where they went in to clear these buildings, as these buildings are being cleared after loitering munitions finished them off, causing others to flee the area, taking fire, and just narrowly missing some of the fire vectored at them from the cordon forces up the street. Loitering munitions would come in and finish them off as they would try to move beyond these buildings, while these guys early on at the opening of the map had fled into the sewers, although they took fire all the way from down the street as that was occurring and lost some people. Most of them had made it in through this open manhole cover and got to safety before the mortar strikes had come in and took these personnel out, who were holding this corner laying by this curb in the prone, while these guys were on the other side of this building trying to seek protection from any intersecting fire. And while these guys ended up going in here, as the arrow indicated in red, surrounded by red, indicates this building would be destroyed with all of these personnel inside and these joining them, with some having been cut down by vehicle-based fire early on. And again, these vehicles destroyed by the missiles, and this one by also ground-based fire at the same time. As that was all happening, all these actions were happening at the same time as these actions were happening. What had happened was, as these forces had moved into this building here, as a mortar took out this technical, what happened was, as these forces crossed here, while their vehicles moved up to be basically supportive of these forces doing this clearance of this block, of houses in this block at the same time. This squad on the corner, after they had maneuvered through this area and all these buildings had been thoroughly cleared here, with this squad moving in, clearing this building and this building, linking up with the two half squads that went through and cleared these houses here, with as half the squad went to the corner and the other half squad went through and cleared these before reuniting with their and making a full squad on the corner. This other squad cleared these buildings before going in this cleared house as they prepared to cross the street, while one sat on the corner to provide overwatch for them to tactically bound across the street first, which by the time they got to this door, their flamethrower man lit this building on fire. As the mortar had already KIA'd these personnel, it was suspected that there were a few in this house, so they burned the house before they went in, kicked the door down, and went through and cleared this house methodically and quickly before they had come out the back, as this squad had then gone in and cleared this area, as they held the area here for them to clear this area while the vehicles moved up to provide their SOP-based outdoor watch of the area. As again, it could be the vehicles or it could be dismounts that do this. As these forces then cleared this building and these forces cleared this one, they then went and cleared this house before moving in to clear this house and this house while they went in and held their position here. As these Americans had already fled and were spotted on ISR assets fleeing this area before trying to cross the street, as they didn't know where to go, they were confused and lost, and they thought that maybe they could make it over here. They got cut down by the vehicle-based fire waiting to destroy them that was by this time right here. And as these forces went in to clear the building, they assisted in the fire, as these forces by which point were at the end of the street when the fire came in from the house and the vehicles that were right here that began to now move up. As these forces went in here, they'd taken some fire from the other side of this wall right here. And as these forces came out to join them in their assault that they would press on these forces on the other side of this wall, these guys had fled as a result while these guys stayed and effectively, even if inadvertently, tried to cover the retreat of these guys that ran into this building by that point in time. Whereas these guys bounded out of the house to the wall. They were throwing hand grenades over and firing over the wall at these forces, as this was a large contingent of armed reactionary civilians who were now being barbecued by the Type 74 flamethrower man in this squad as they had cleared this house and come out and were being engaged even as they went in this house, but they were firing out of the house while half the squad came out first. The other half was firing from the house before they came out and joined, as the other half squad that had made it outside was now laying suppressive fire for them to join the rest of the squad. And they all began to lay down fire on these forces across this wall at each other. And they had used hand grenades, their flamethrowers, and small arms fire to cut these guys down. And the vehicles held their fire because by the time they were moving up into this position here, they didn't want to risk any crossfire, so they just held their fire and let these guys do everything. And because these guys were, these PAP squads were working together and vectoring their fire in a general X shape, and eventually ended up catching this building on fire, the shopping center, as a result of using their flamethrower on these guys, these armed reactionary civilians were quickly destroyed. The flamethrower was of such a might and such a power when used in arcing fashion against these forces and in conjunction with hand grenades that they had quickly KIA'd this big group of armed reactionary civilians. They could not withstand the combo of hand grenades, flamethrower, and light machine gun and assault rifle fire into this area. They just couldn't. There was no, like, this occurred too quickly. In real life, this type of a situation would have ended nearly as soon as it began. As that had all been ISR directed as well, they effectively already knew when they were going in to clear these homes that there was a grouping of Americans over here anyway. Even the vehicle forces knew that, but they were going to let their dismounts handle it, as their dismounts were fully capable with their flamethrower, grenades, their 35mm tube-fired grenades they could have used, but they opted not to, and their small arms fire with their automatic weapons and also their standard riflemen. They just cut these guys down. Although the armed reactionary civilians had weapons of their own, and they fired back, as indicated by these green arrows, the green on the ends of these arrows, they did little to nothing, as they mostly hit them in their body armor and just narrowly missed their heads in some cases. but they didn't have very long to fire back because the intensity of the weapons utilized against them, not to mention even the loitering munition strikes that would come in on them, as some of these loitering munitions back here hadn't even have been used yet and were circling the area and supported these forces, had been basically utilized to such an extent where they just annihilated these personnel, causing these to flee. They didn't want any of this, as they were starting to also be engaged by the vehicle fire, firing this direction away from these forces here and here, because they were not going to hit their own forces and risk that, but they could fire at an angle to where they fired at these personnel. As you can see, there's red on either end of this arrow, which means they were taking casualties as they were crossing the street from the vehicles now beginning to move up to keep pace with their troops over here and here, firing at these forces gradually as they moved up. Everything from their coax machine gun, 7.62x54, to their 25 at times. And they also had their loitering munitions, again, supporting this action here. Flamethrower, grenade, small arms fire, and light machine gun fire. They just cut these guys down. I mean, this happened in a matter of seconds. This was not a long and drawn-out firefight by any means. It was over too quickly. And as the same thing happened up here, as the mortar had already taken some of them out, and the others just decided to stay in the area and tried, and by the time these squads moved in, tried to resist, they were cut down from a hail of fire from these homes. They were slaughtered before these half squads cleared these buildings, and then this squad moved from this building here to clear this one, and then this gas station before reuniting. By the time they had gotten in these buildings to clear them, when this half squad was right here and the other one was clearing this building, artillery fire had been called in to just destroy this, as these guys had been seen already going in there by the ISR assets, and as these guys were running in here, artillery came down and finished them off as well, completely annihilating this building. And just beyond this block was the other cordon forces. This was a longer city block of businesses, as the business streets sort of began in this area where there were a few parallel streets of businesses, and this block here was heavily shelled, as was this one. And as some of these forces had fled into this building, they narrowly escaped destruction of this building, which would be shelled, as there would be an artillery marker right on the other side, as just a tiny part of the building here, same here. This building would be shelled as well, so would this one and this one, as these forces would halt their advance right here, as this would be the limit of their advance, because their cordon forces to the east of them were relatively now close to their positions, and they could see each other with the naked eye, as they were very close to one another at this point. And they didn't need their optics like way back here to see one another. They could see each other with the naked eye, and of course they always knew where each other was based on their combat data links and radio communications and their ISR networks, but everything was coordinated at a high degree of precision to avoid friendly fire incidences. And as this building was on fire at the time, these two squads, after finishing off these forces, had moved up here with their vehicles on either side, finishing their limit of advance all together along this street, when the artillery was coming in and decimating these buildings all up and down this street, with the cordon forces to the east of them being safely outside of the bombardment as they were on the street all the way on the other side of these longer blocks. And they could see everything from their side into each block as it pertained to the cordon. So essentially nobody really survived other than a very tiny handful of, like, a few different POWs that had been taken, and those that had escaped through this open manhole cover that was open at the time of this surrounding, as it had been going on, as these forces rapidly raced in to surround the area. They raced in from the north and then hooked south with one company. Two took the north, two took the south, and they linked up, while these two companies gradually moved through the area, clearing these streets in this 1.5 mile by 1 mile north-south area. Similar was going on in this pocket here, as there are about almost 500 armed reactionary civilians in both pockets combined. So roughly 1,000 defenders who were disorganized and ill-prepared. All they had was small arms and maybe a few Molotovs in the best case that could be utilized against vehicles. However, due to the close coordination of the troops and vehicles, as well as even some fire support from the sniper spotter teams on the roof, loitering munitions support, mortar support all throughout the map, and loitering munitions support, as the mortar company had to divide their mortar support between these two different pockets, as well as their other battalions operating elsewhere. So the mortars were a little more limited than they could have been otherwise, but the artillery more than made up for it, as the 155 strikes on this block, and this block, as well as in this area of these 4 blocks, just decimated large groupings of armed reactionary civilians that could have been more of a nuisance as a defensive force than they were otherwise, as they were destroyed and ripped apart by the combo of artillery, mortars in different areas, loitering munitions, sniper fire got even some of them. As you have to understand, one has to understand that these guys were busy the entire time overwatching their men. And the vehicle-based fires coming in from the vehicles, which were very potent, from 12.7 millimeter on the APCs to 25 auto cannon and 7.62x54 on the IFEs, and the ground-based fires wielded by these troops working hand in hand, in tandem with loitering munition support, ISR dominance, troops rushing into buildings rapidly, going room to room, hall to hall, closet to closet, and businesses even, everywhere, clearing thoroughly and rapidly these structures. As it would take, due to the distances traveled, it would take them approximately 2 hours to clear and thoroughly go through this area. It would still be methodically and thoroughly cleared by the time they reached their limit of advance, where beyond, after these artillery strikes decimated these businesses in this block, their anvil force would basically be linked up with them through such a close proximity to them as beyond this block, again, were their anvil forces, and no armed reactionary civilians would have dared to run directly into them unless they were that desperate and trying to get out, as most of them were trying to find a way out. They had gone underground, and although they turned around as they initially were escaping from these forces, they turned around out of desperation and were cut down as a result. Many others wouldn't even try that. They would basically either go down fighting, and very few would surrender, and the fortunate few that were fortunate enough, this handful right here that managed to get into the sewer system while under fire, as they would lose some of their number, they would use the city's underground passages with many other defenders to try to stay out of the constellation of ISR assets, which aided the PLA, PAP, and other coalition forces in controlling everything that was above ground. There was not anything that couldn't be seen above ground except in very rare circumstances. And this even would not ever last. One rare circumstance being IR camouflaging from either burning structures or from certain plant matter. But again, that would not last, as any type of movement would almost always certainly be spotted, as this constellation of ISR assets was almost a foolproof way to see every single solitary development on the modern fluid battlefield, as satellite to high altitude drone and some aircraft even in some places, as well as all the way down to the quadcopter assets, could in real time surveil the entire battlefield and see virtually every single solitary occurrence happening thereupon. Again, except for some rare circumstances, this was exclusively almost always the case. And the only way to escape this was to be in an extremely thickly wooded or mountainous area, or some rare other types of nature areas, or to go underground to completely escape the virtual all-seeing eye, as it could be called, of the Chinese and Russian ISR networks, as that's essentially what it became for them. As these forces were all spotted first and dispatched in different ways, with vehicles, with sniper spotter fire, with all of the different loitering munition strikes coming in, mortar strikes, artillery, and of course ground-based vehicle and squad-based fires, along with everything else, even combat drone-based fire at the very beginning, firing CM502 KGs and HJ-10s at certain ground targets, destroying vehicles and homes and everything immediately around them. This was a devastating battle, and although due to the distances that had to be methodically patrolled and cleared through this very sophisticated and precision-oriented cordon and sweep operation, as they typically were, it only took them just under a few hours to do it. In both pockets by each of the two battalions tasked with clearing these flanks of 249 as it connected with 610, the inner ring road of the downtown area, as this was just outside of downtown in more of the uptown type of area of the inner core metro area, as fighting in downtown was already well underway, as PAP forces utilized their grappling skills and their speed and surprise to smash their way into buildings and grapple onto the upper floors of them to seize TV stations, police stations, and other critical buildings from the battalion that went into the city, as well as begin the initial phases of destroying the defenders. The defenders would take to the underground in the inner city and use this as a way to conduct a sort of whack-a-mole type of campaign where the PAP forces would have to smash these forces anywhere they revealed themselves. And there was a mixed, tiny element of military and paramilitary with all of these reactionary armed civilians who would end up being the most effective, as they had a tiny stock of AT-4s and would be a harassing force against the PAP, causing them to lose 2 vehicles from 1 battalion, which was a pinprick attack and almost meant nothing, but it caused the PAP to become very thorough, which would take even more time, as the fighting downtown would last a number of hours, as again, the entire Battle of Houston, and even just beyond with the PLA and Marines and the other 3 brigades of the PLA ground forces or armies, 83rd Group Army, that were to the east of the city, would take approximately 18 hours to fully and thoroughly secure the entire metro area. It was a major, massive battle, but it was a quicker battle than even that of some of the other major metro areas in the South Central Invasion sector. In the next installment of the Hypothetical Invasion documentary series, utilizing 4th-generation warfare doctrines, the battle that would break out as the surviving tiny elements of the 1st of the 98th Cav from the 2 battalion or squadron-sized element of 1st Squadron of 278th ACR plus 1st of the 98th Cav, which was a separate, different squadron and not part of the 278th ACR. The 1st of the 98th had a surviving heavy company or troop and also a rifle platoon from one of their 2 rifle troops that would move into the William Hobby Airport area and end up being engaged as they were spotted from far away moving into the area, as they had been out of the path of the Tu-22M bomber, being several miles away from the William Hobby area, but they were still over a mile away from the battle that was taking place between the mechanized infantry, and instead would move through the destroyed neighborhoods, left destroyed in the wake of the Tu-22M strike on the rest of their squadron, the 1st and the 98th, and on 1st Squadron. They would travel through the destroyed neighborhoods into the vicinity of the William P. Hobby Airport, which is being established as a megafob, and they would end up being embattled by not only the different combat battalions operating in the airport area, now moving in to establish it as a megafob, including even elements of the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade moving in as well, but also by the armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade racing up I-45 into the area, who would be who would end up engaging and destroying the armed reactionary civilians predominantly, along with assistance from the mechanized infantry forces and combat engineers, but they would be the force that would be doing most of the fighting in the area, and they would destroy the remnants of the 1st and the 98th Cav and most of the armed reactionary civilians outside of the William P. Hobby Airport. That will be explored in the next installment of the Hypothetical Invasion documentary series, highlighting 4th-generation warfare doctrines To be continued.